Welcome to this week's Halacha Shir. It is entitled Birchas HaTorah and the Mitzvah Boy. A very interesting topic which actually has a very common issue which we'll discuss. But the question is, why are we discussing it this week? How is it related to Parshas Toldos? We always try and find an interesting halachic topic related to the coming week's Sedra. How is it connected to Parshas Toldos? So let's take a look at the first box. If you're listening online, please do email me at j.golker@gmail.com. I'll send you the handout. The Psukim read as follows. Well-known story. Vayimlu yomeha loledes. Rivka, after 20 years of waiting, is pregnant, and now she is ready to give birth. V'hinei soimim bevitna, and she is giving birth to twins. Vayetze horishin admoini. The first one comes out red. Kuloi kadere se'er, like a red mantle, a red coat. Vayikru ushmoi Esov, and they call his name Esov. Va'achrechein yotza achiv v'yodo echezes be'akev Esov. Then the second child emerges, holding on to the heel of Esau. Yaakov Yitzchak ben Shishim Shana beledes Esau, and they call him Yaakov. And at that point, Yitzchak is 60 years old. Vayigdalu hanaorim. Fast forward, the boys grow up. Vahi Esau ish yedeh tzayid ish sadeh v'Yaakov ish tom yoshev oiholim. So familiar psukim. On that pasuk, Rashi says Vayigdalu hanaorim. Rashi says Kolzman shahu katanim. Whilst they were children, lo hayu nikarim b'ma'aseim. It wasn't clear what their characteristics were. You couldn't tell from their actions. Ve'ein adam medaktik bohem mativum. You couldn't quite ascertain their personalities yet. However, kivin shenasu b'nei shleishes reishana. But once they hit 13, they became gedolim. Zeh pirish the bottom midrashos. Yaakov Avinu went in the direction of the Beis Hamedrash. V'zeh pirish Avodah Zarah, and Esau went towards in the direction of Avodah Zarah. So there is a reference to children turning bar mitzvah. That is the connection to this week's Sedra. We have actually had reference to it in the past with Yishmael. His bris milah took place when he became an adult at 13 years old. But it's an opportunity to discuss a very interesting topic regarding bar mitzvah. Let's give a bit of context and then we'll discuss, then we'll look at it inside. Essentially, it's based on a Minchas Osher, a very interesting tshuva of Rabbi Osher Weiss. But let me give you the background. We know that one of the powerful, most important mitzvahs, brachas that we make is Birchas HaTorah. It's a mitzvah d'oraisa, and every single morning we say Birchas HaTorah to prepare ourselves for the opportunity, for the privilege of learning Torah that day, and that requires a bracha, and we say Birchas HaTorah every single morning, and that is true for a katan as well. You have a child who is under bar mitzvah, he too will say Birchas HaTorah on the day of his bar mitzvah. Let's say it's this time of year, it gets dark very early, and let's say he wakes up in the morning, and on a Sunday morning he gets up. Let's say his bar mitzvah bo bayom is that night, Sunday night, spinning over to Monday. So he's looking forward to his bar mitzvah suda that evening, and he's got his pshetel ready, his drasha. He wakes up Sunday morning, and then at the beginning of Shachris, the beginning of the day, he will say Birchas HaTorah. Fast forward a few hours, when it gets dark, he gets ready in his new bar mitzvah suit and his new hat, and is ready to say his pshetel, his drasha, and yet he won't say a new Birchas HaTorah. He will rely on the Birchas HaTorah that he said that morning. The trouble is, the Birchas HaTorah he said that morning was said as a katan. So how does that work? How can the Birchas HaTorah, which he said in the morning, fulfill his obligation of Birchas HaTorah as an adult? He's a new entity now. He's no longer a child. His chiyuv to say it this morning was one of chinuch. And now, as an adult, he's a full-fledged member of Klal Yisrael. So how can the Birchas HaTorah in the morning discharge his obligation of Birchas HaTorah now that he is an adult later in the day? Let's see how Minchas Osher puts it. If you look at paragraph 2. Every child, Hamagia lemitzvahs, when he becomes bar mitzvah, loma inachayev levarich Birchas HaTorah belel bar mitzvah. Why doesn't he have to say Birchas HaTorah again on the night that he turns bar mitzvah? Tahalo habrocha shebirch baboka, because lechora, the bracha he said in the morning, ein bo kadei lepotra belaylo, that cannot exempt him in the evening. Surely, tahalo baboka lohoy mechuv el midrabanon. His obligation to say Birchas HaTorah in the morning was only midrabanon, or but say sakechavim, and then late at night when it becomes dark, nase bar chiyuv min HaTorah, his obligation is min HaTorah. Or kamosha katan in the moitzias hagod yedei chayvah. So just like a child cannot be moitzi the chiyuv of an adult, kach lo yuchal hakatan lifter es atzmai la'achar shenichnas l'chal chiyuv deraisa. So too, just like a katan can't be moitzi an adult, well, so too he can't be moitzi himself when he was a child for when he becomes an adult later in the day, even albeit several hours later. So, says the Minchas Osher, if you look at paragraph 3, take a step back. What are the story about mitzvahs performed by a child? Hine, this is in Chelik Aleph of the Child and Shuvas of Minchas Osher, Siman Dalet. Hine, etzem ha'anocha, the actual premise, the mitzvah shekim odem ba'edoi potter, eine oile lechavosoi, that the mitzvah performed by a person when he is potter cannot help him lechavosoi k'shnis chayev, to fulfill his obligation when he is now obligated. What's the source for that? Muveres b'Rosh Hashanah Kafches. One of the sources is a Gemara in Rosh Hashanah Daf Kafches. T'im kafay shade. That means some insanity takes over him. He is now a shaita. He's not considered a sane, mentally well person. V'ochel matzah. And in that state of being a shaita, he eats matzah on the night of Pesach. V'shuv chazav v'nishtafa. And then he recovers and he becomes compos mentis, he becomes well again. Ba'od leil, in that evening, lo yosidei chavosai, he has not discharged his obligation. He may have eaten 3 kazesim of matzah, but he was unwell at the time. And then later, when he becomes well, it's still the night, he's got a chiyuv to eat again. V'chayev lachzor v'lechol. V'lechayra hu adin b'nidin didan. And presumably exactly the same situation in our story, i.e., the child, in the morning, he was potter, he was exempt. So how can that recitation of Birchas HaTorah in the morning discharge his obligation to say Birchas HaTorah as an adult later that evening? Omnom. HaTorah Evan, I'm on the third line of paragraph number 3. Omnom. HaTorah Evan Kosov. Shom. De'ein ze mishum shepotter haya, k'she'ochel. There, in Rosh Hashanah, the Torah Evan says that the reason why he's got a chiyuv to eat matzah again when he recovers later that evening is not because he was potter when he ate it, ela mishum sheshaita dinoi kamisasek. When he was not well and he had the status of a shaita, he has the din of someone who is misasek. Ve'ein b'maisav shei mitzvah klal, and therefore his actions, what he was doing, the eating of the matzah, was not considered a mitzvah at all. He was totally preoccupied. He was misasek. He was in a different world, and therefore his action of eating matzah when he was a shaita just simply does not count. We just ignore it. And according to his words, and you could say that there is a difference, therefore, between a cotton and a shaita, and the cotton perhaps is different because he is aware of what he's doing and he thinks he's saying Birchas HaTorah, and there's more mind, there's more das involved, and maybe there's a difference. The gam cotton didn't come misasik, but the Torah rejects that and says no, that a cotton also has the status of someone who is misasik. Says the Minchas Osher, Rabbi Weiss, that's very strange. If that's the case, how could you, if you're negating the actions of a cotton, how could you ever have a situation where a cotton is mitzi his father his chiyuv of eating if he ate a kazayis? What does that mean? Excuse me. It means as follows: that let's say the chiyuv to bench is min HaTorah is only if you ate to satiation. Sorry, you ate, you were satisfied, and then you bench. I.e., you ate and you're full now. So then you have a chiyuv min HaTorah to bench. What if you only had a kazayis, a small amount of bread? You're not full, so then you've got a chiyuv midrabanan. Says Rabbi Weiss that we know the well-known halacha that a cotton can be moitzi his father if the father ate a kazayis. Why? Because the cotton's obligation is midrabanan. The father's obligation in that situation is also midrabanan. So therefore, the cotton's chiyuv drabanan can be moitzi the father's chiyuv drabanan. So you see, therefore, that the child's action does count. You have to therefore conclude, says the Minchas Osher, that a child has not got the status of misasek, where we sort of ignore his mitzvah. The Gemara says it mafurish there in Chulin Yud Beis Omid Beis to cotton yesh le'maisa, that the actions of a cotton are significant. Continues the Minchas Osher, and I've extracted. I haven't taken the whole tshuva, but I've taken the key parts. He then continues and he quotes the Shayas and Shuvas of the Eretz HaTzvi. V'Shayas and Shuvas Eretz HaTzvi Siman Tezayin Kosaf. Do'achein chayovim belel habar mitzvah lechavein lotzis dechavos Birchas HaTorah Birchas Avos Olam ba'arvis. He quotes the Shayas and Shuvas Eretz HaTzvi, who says that you know what the mitzvah boy should do, again addressing our particular concern. when he davens Ma'ariv, which is the standard what he will do before the Suda begins, they'll daven Ma'ariv. Often he is the Baal Tefillah, and hopefully he'd have practiced, because sometimes I've seen situations where he hasn't practiced, and he clearly hasn't practiced. But let's say he davens Ma'ariv, and before Shema, there are two brachas in Kriya Shema, and when he says Ahavas Olam, he should have in mind to fulfill, to say that should count as his Birchas HaTorah. That's what the Shuvas Eretz Tzvi concludes. But he doesn't agree. Says the Minchas Osha, I don't think it's necessary. I don't think that is the story. Now, and therefore he'll conclude that it's not necessary, and he doesn't need to. But the question is why. So let's take a look. This is fascinating. Paragraph 5 at the top of the next page. There is no even a small doubt regarding this shaila. Not only does he not actually need to say Birchas HaTorah when it gets dark and he becomes a bar mitzvah, but he doesn't even need to be mechaven in the second brach of Kriya Shema and Avas Olam to fulfill Yedei Chayvasa of Birchas HaTorah. Why? Listen to this. This is not a new question. It's not a 21st century question. This question has been applicable for every child Yisrael b'Giyul Mitzvahs. Every mitzvah boy has had exactly the same question. For shtikas kol gedolei hadoros, in the silence of all the great Talmidei Chachomim throughout the generations, me'oz, from time immemorial, me'oz HaMishnah, from the time of the Mishnah, ad yomeinu, until today, 2,000 years later, Machrezes ke'elef edim, sort of shouts out like 1,000 witnesses. She'en kol chivas Birchas HaTorah vetes ala odom belel knisosei. There's not like a chiyuv to say Birchas HaTorah crouching over him. The old Torah HaMitzvahs, as soon as he turns by mitzvah, he's got to quickly say Birchas HaTorah. We don't see this in the Gedolim, and there's no source for this in Chazal that's saying this is what is obligated on this mitzvah boy. And on Val Katana Mizu Kosof HaChazon Ish, on a smaller issue, the Chazon Ish writes in Shvius and Siman Zayin, the Shtikas HaRishonim B'She'ela, that the silence of Rishonim on a particular matter, Shkicha Ma'oid, is very common. The Hachra HaTorah Mikol HaRayos, that's the strongest raya of it all. In other words, the fact they don't say anything is a raya that it's not needed. V'chein Zeh Kosof HaBeis Meir, and he quotes also a Beis Meir, Shetov Lilmoid mistimas harishonim mililmoid mipirshei achronim. Amazing statement. It's better to learn from the omission, from what the Rishonim leave out, than what achronim actually do right. So therefore, the fact that the Rishonim don't deal with this problem suggests that it's just not a problem. Benidin didon, and therefore, kal v'chomer, he says, benidin didon, how much more so in our situation, but the question is why? So I understand that it's not a problem, because the very fact that the Rishonim do not deal with it suggests that it's not a problem. The question is why. So let's take a look at the paragraph 6. V'nira, b'zeh. I agree that a cotton can't be motzi a gadol, and someone who is potter from a mitzvah can't be motzi someone who is chayiv. However, but a person can be Moitzi himself, but tonight shall call upon him also Mitzvah shal mitzvah. He can still, however, be Moitzi himself so long as he did some sort of action. The kol she'asa mitzvah, or b'shah shekima yotzi bo yedei chevosoi, that when this person has performed a mitzvah and has fulfilled it and has discharged his obligation in doing so, la'olam ein chozer l'schayiv. He doesn't now sort of become chayiv once again. V'shani, and therefore this child says Birchas HaTorah in the morning. He did exactly what he needed to do. He's yoytze his chiyuv of saying Birchas HaTorah. Now, later in the day, he becomes an adult and his chiyuv increases from a drabanan to a deraisa. He doesn't become chayiv again to say it again. Because he did the ma'aseh, he fulfilled his obligation, and therefore he doesn't become chayiv again. What about the shaita? V'shani mishaita she'ochel matzah, and you can contrast that to the case of the shaita who was not mentally well, who ate matzah. Then shelo yasa mitzvah klal. He didn't do a mitzvah at all. When that shaita was eating matzah, that wasn't an action at all. He was totally out of it. He wasn't performing anything. In mishum dahavik misasik, either because he's got a status of misasik, in mishum shepatu legamri, or he's totally exempt in that state of mind. Or mufka min mitzvahs, he's just totally detached from mitzvahs. Masha'en kein bekotten shechayv akol pon midrabanan. In contrast to the Kotten, who at least is chayiv midrabanan for kiyum b'mitzvah b'shaita, and he fulfilled the mitzvah in the right time. And therefore concludes the Minchas Osher, in the final paragraph, and this I therefore want to be melamed zchus and to explain the minig of Kal Yisrael mimois olam shelo levarich Birchas HaTorah, that they were never required, the B'mitzvah boy, to make Birchas HaTorah when he became bar mitzvah that evening, when it turned night, or lechavin, not say to the chavos Birchas Kriya Shema belel ha-bar mitzvah, or to require him to have in mind when he says avas olam, that he should fulfill his biblical, his Torah obligation of saying Birchas HaTorah. We don't require that. Omno concludes the Minchas Osher, there's no harm, if the father quietly tells the son, listen, when you say Kriya Shema tonight, just before you say it, you say Avas Olam, have in mind to be Yotze Birchas Kriya Shema. There's no harm. But I don't want this to become normative halacha, that we have to make every boy do this. It's not necessary, because that was never the Messiah, and he said it in the morning, and he did it, and he fulfilled his obligation. Therefore, you can't re-obligate him further and later. And therefore, if he wants to, there's no harm, but it shouldn't become normative halacha. So this is a very interesting area. And it's, as I say, this is a very common shaila. Baruch Hashem, boys are becoming mitzvah day in, day out, and that perhaps explains why it's not the custom in Klal Yisrael to require the mitzvah boy to say his Birchas HaTorah again, or even to have in mind to be fulfilled his mitzvah Birchas HaTorah in the brachas of Kriya Shema. If he wants to, he can, but it's not that it should become normative halacha.